Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending wherever you are in the world. The number of attendees are still rising, and we know are joining us from all over the planet. My name is David Tyfield, and I'm the chair this evening for the third annual John Urry Lecture, which is taking the unusual form of this online panel. So just a few words of welcome. Let me just change the picture if you don't mind. So this event is the annual John Urry Lecture at Lancaster University, which was established a few years ago by our now former Vice-Chancellor as an indefinite memory to one of Lancaster's most illustrious and dedicated members of staff. Professor John Urry worked at Lancaster from its earliest days in the late 1960s, straight from his PhD in Cambridge, until his sudden and untimely death in March 2016. As well as holding multiple senior positions within the university over that period of more than 4 decades, John became one of the most influential and highly cited sociologists in the world. His wide-ranging and imaginative work has fundamentally shaped what are now key avenues and sub- or transdisciplinary fields of inquiry in the social sciences, including early work on the economies of science and space, to work beyond sociology in analysis of dynamic and global complex systems, explorations of the consumption of place, space and the tourist gaze, and perhaps most famously, work that has founded 2 areas of scholarship that have left enduring institutional legacies here at Lancaster. On the one hand, first, through his seminal work with Mimi Scheller on the field Mobilities, he explored a social science adequate for a world on the move and no longer adequately explained in terms of static container state societies. John also then founded the Centre for Mobilities Research and Mobilities Journal, together with Mimi Scheller and Kevin Hannam. From its inaugural conference on alternative mobility futures in 2004, CeMoRe, as it's known, has grown into a hub for interdisciplinary mobilities research and an international network of mobilities researchers. In the Global Mobilities Network, we bring together over 40 institutions from 28 countries, all addressing the relational politics of immobilities and mobilities, from migration to offshoring to decarbonising transport. The mobilities paradigm and mobile methods provide novel analytical and creative leverage for social change and innovation at multiple scales, from the everyday to the geopolitical and even the interplanetary. Today, CeMoRe has recently, under the new leadership of Nicholas Sperling, launched a new 5-year programme of work focusing on the climate emergency as the key issue of the moment, and one regarding which there is the possibility for significant mutual illumination between expedited deep sustainable transition, of course not least in transport, and the mobilities paradigm. Secondly, though, in his latter work, John again led the way in a timely interest exploring social futures, whether after the car or after oil, facing global climate change, or even just simply what is the future, an area which is now a subject of intense and growing academic interest. His concern with futures led him to found the Institute of Social Futures in 2015 at Lancaster, together with Linda Woodhead, and this is developed in no small part from his research on climate change and sustainable livable cities, and has grown to a vibrant research community at Lancaster, enabling future forming research and collaborations. And we just have to mention our gratitude to ISF and to Louise Bush in particular for their invaluable support in organising today's event and this unusual way of holding it. So this event is in John's honour, and it's an annual showcase of some of the most prestigious names internationally in sociology and the social sciences, who are brought together in or by, in this case, Lancaster, an opportunity for agenda-setting public discussion and a celebration of his work and this work to which John was so committed. So in this spirit, we're absolutely delighted to be welcoming for this, the third annual John Urry Lecture, leading mobility scholars, Professors Tim Cresswell, Mimi Scheller and Noel Salazar, all of whom I'll introduce properly shortly. To our subject matter then, 2020 is not quite over, but I think we can be fairly sure that it will long be remembered as the year when the world stopped moving, trying to contain the movement of the coronavirus COVID-19 as it spread across the world. As we enter the autumn, the challenges of governing societies that have become increasingly dependent on free and accelerating circulation, movement and mobility, while containing that movement, have returned with a vengeance. Headlines and news feeds are utterly dominated at the moment, perhaps with the exception of the American election, by the challenges and paradoxes of ongoing attempts to square mobilities and immobilities. In short, the global pandemic has thrust mobilities into the epicenter of contemporary politics and society. So in this year's event, we pick up on this key issue of the moment, both for the world and mobility studies alike. What does a mobilities lens have to offer to illuminate our current COVID-19 predicament? What issues, usually overlooked and neglected, does it bring to the fore, whether explanatory or normative? And what futures does it enable us to see or envision, for better or worse? I'm delighted to say that to discuss this crucial topic, we have three of the world's leading thinkers on the subject of mobilities. So to introduce them in first name alphabetical order, first up we have Mimi Scheller. Mimi is the professor of sociology and head of the Department of Sociology and the founding director of the Center for Mobilities Research and Policy at Drexel University in Philadelphia. She's founding co-editor of the journal Mobilities and an associate editor of Transfers and a past president of the International Association of the History of Transport, Traffic and Mobility. She has unquestionably helped to establish the interdisciplinary field of mobilities research and is author and co-editor of 12 books, including most recently Mobility Justice, an agenda-setting book, if I may say so, for Verso, and Island Futures, Caribbean Survival in the Anthropocene with Duke this year. Secondly, we have Noel Salazar, who is research professor in social and cultural anthropology at the Catholic University Leuven in Belgium. He is editor of the book series Worlds in Motion and co-editor of books such as Pacing Mobilities, Methodologies of Mobility, Keywords of Mobility, Regimes of Mobility, Tourism Imaginaries, and author of several books including Momentous Mobilities and Envisioning Eden. He is also Secretary General of the International Union of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences and a past president of the European Association of Social Anthropologists, in which he founded the Anthropology and Mobility Network, AnthroMob. And finally, and our first speaker is Tim Cresswell, who is the Ogilvie Professor of Geography at Edinburgh and a published poet. His work has been instrumental in developing connections between cultural geography, I would say alongside sociology, perhaps the most important, alongside sociology and anthropology, the most important of the disciplines within mobilities, and the mobilities paradigm in books such as On the Move, Geographies of Mobilities, Gender Mobilities, and most recently a short introduction to Place. Recent works include poetry such as Plastiglomerate, which sounds fascinating, and Maxwell Street, Writing and Thinking Place. I should also add, as an editor of Mobilities Journal, that this journal has a special issue on pandemic immobilities, that's immobilities and mobilities, including work from many other excellent scholars from around the world, which is on its way to expedited publication in 2021. So please look out for that. So just to finish off, here is the programme for our event this evening. Hopefully I'm not already running over time. I am just about, so I'll stop and hand over without further ado to our first speaker, only to say that, as you can see, we'll have 10 minutes from each of them. Then we have a chance to listen to them talk amongst themselves for a few minutes, and then finally we will open it up to Q&A. So please post your questions in the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We will then filter through those and ask them to the panel. And hopefully we'll finish roughly on time in just under an hour and a half. Okay, so let me just finish sharing my screen. And as I say, without further ado, over to our first speaker, Tim Cresswell.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be involved in this. It's a great honour to be in an event associated with John Urry's name, such as this. You know, I can imagine John being in an event like this. Where I met him most of the time was mobility-related events in various places around the world. And part of what my thinking about this is thinking, well, what would John think about being immobilized and participating in conferences or other kinds of meetings such as what we're doing now. I mean, one of his sort of central things that he thought about was the relationship between mobility, telecommunicative mobility or virtual mobility, and how that's linked to face-to-face relationships and meetings, what some people call wetware, which is us, our bodies. So what I want to do in terms of a provocation, which is how this was expressed, was to ask the question and provide the provocation of how might we value mobility in a positive way, particularly long distance mobility after COVID-19. Clearly, we are living in a time of unprecedented transformation in global mobility in a very, very quick, very short period of time. From the micro scale to what we can do, there were periods where I live where you were supposed to go for one walk a day, otherwise you were supposed to be inside. That was the strictest version of lockdown that we had here in Edinburgh. To the fact that 90% of global air travel ended, particularly for passengers, for a period of time early on in the COVID era. To the various kinds of inequalities that have been produced by the expectation that people can work from home when it is well established that many kinds of jobs cannot be done from home, and there's a disparity in privilege and access to mobility that comes from that. This is of course all based on the fact that viruses can only be successful by becoming passengers and becoming part of assemblages. And we are the most important part of the assemblage for COVID-19, which actually is the disease, not the virus, but they're connected. And so obviously it makes sense to stop our bodies from moving in order to combat the virus. And so anything I say about revaluing mobility or worrying about the value of mobility is not to say that I do not believe that we should stop moving, because clearly that is the way, in general, that viruses can be prevented from spreading. As an aside, and maybe a secondary provocation, I do think it's interesting how the kinds of emergency connected to COVID-19 produced a very sudden and dramatic response such as this. You know, 90% of air travel being eliminated very quickly, whereas the kinds of emergency that are longer, the temporalities are different, of climate change have not produced the same response. Where I'm pretty sure that we know that the negative effects on human health, including death, of climate change are going to be far greater than COVID will produce. and yet the response has not been the same. So that's something maybe we could talk about. If I go back to the work of John and Mimi and others in the origins of the new mobilities paradigm, one of the things that struck me when it was happening was that it was a revaluation of mobility. It was and still is, a body of work that said that either mobility had been ignored and black boxed in theorization, or it had been actually conveyed as a negative disutility, dysfunction, form of transgression in systems that would otherwise be spatially defined, and that mobility needed to be revalued and thought about in ways that recognized the narratives, meanings, and cultures that mobility was entwined with. Obvious examples of this are around commuting, when commuting was always seen as this kind of dysfunctional, disutility, dead time, all the other phrases that we use to describe it, and many of the works within the new mobilities paradigm or the mobilities turn revalued time we spend in cars or on bicycles or walking or in trains or even in aeroplanes as times that could be spent productively and that we valued in particular ways. It allowed us to get away from imaginaries that saw mobility in a way that simply sought to reduce it or erase it. And so what I'm worried about is how the kinds of things that we have to do in order to stop the spread of the illness and the virus may lead to similar kinds of devaluing of mobility as we've become used to, both in theoretical work and empirically and politically in the world. That is that the reactions to people moving have become highly coded in negative ways. And we can think of this in relation to something like in the UK, there was a case of people walking in the Peak District that were monitored by police drones, and then they weren't named, but they were shamed on news stories and other things. Pictures of people walking in the Peak District and little labels attached to them saying this is not necessary movement, so don't do it. And they were clearly in the middle of nowhere. I mean, not nowhere, it's the Peak District, but there was no one else around them. It was like an old elderly couple going for a walk. Similarly, early responses to so-called super spreaders. There was one gentleman early on in Britain who was seen as the root cause of a large number of people diagnosed with COVID, who had been to Singapore, come back through a ski resort in Europe, arrived in Brighton, and there were sort of maps of his movements in the newspapers, and the use of the term super spreader, he owned it. I mean, he wasn't shy about saying, yes, this was me, but it started to produce this sort of idea of certain kinds of people, I think we're very familiar with as negatively coded because of their mobility. So one of the responses that's been, I think, have been quite pervasive over the last 6 months, 9 months, has been various forms of localism. Now, one obvious form of this is what you might call Trumpian localism. Trump, well before COVID, was saying in his public addresses that everything was about the local. That's part of his agenda, is to bring things back to some form of the local in a very conservative way. Or actually, not even conservative, neo-reactionary way is the best way I would describe it. This was, of course, accompanied by activities such as closing the borders, but not closing the borders to everyone, closing the borders originally to people from China, despite the fact that the spread of COVID within the US was already well established, and the strain of the virus that was actually infecting the most people was from Europe. He did actually close the borders to Europe after that. But that was accompanied, of course, by the discourse of the China virus, the Wuhan virus, all that kind of xenophobic labeling that has become very important in relation to COVID. And so there was a layering of particular kinds of actions and particular kinds of codings and cultural or meaning, I would say, that emphasize this kind of nationalist neo-reactionary localism. But alongside that, there's also been a progressive response, which is, in my view, rightly, but still I think it's worth exploring, pointed out that the origins of COVID are not Chineseness, but they are the incursion of capital into areas that previously weren't being monetized and capitalized, particularly what we might call of nature. And that the relationship between animals and humans had therefore changed, and that diseases that move from animals to humans have become more prevalent, accompanied by logistical supply chain networks and air travel that have created the globalized world, the mobile lives that John would write about. This world of mobility, I'm talking about people writing in The Nation and places like that, had become part of the problem. Closer to home in the UK, we've had a number of responses, a number of diagnoses of responses to COVID, saying that national responses aren't working and that local responses are what needed, particularly with track and trace. That basically national or big scale ways of dealing with this are not appropriate, and so we need local responses to it. And then possibly at the smaller scale still, we have what people call hyper localism of mutual aid. So mutual aid as something that with its origins in geography, from Kropotkin, from anarchist geography, has become this sort of suddenly a well-known term. I'm not sure everybody knows that it's anarchist, but because it's been dissociated from that in some ways. The mutual aid at street levels, WhatsApp groups on individual streets or apartment blocks, people helping each other. Mutual aid has been in the news as a sign of the altruism of people in the face of COVID, and again another kind of localism. So what I want to sort of conclude with, I don't know what time it is, I'm not tracking time, but David will look at me in a strange way if I'm getting close, is to think about the moral geographies of localism, a retreat into some kind of smaller scale space, regardless of political persuasion. Is being argued for that we can construct safer spaces that are local. So where does that leave mobility? Some are positively valued, some have become more positively valued, particularly cycling and walking, but public transport is severely compromised because people think it's unsafe, so buses and aeroplanes. And cars have been valorized as, again, these safe capsules in which people can exist and manage their own space and not be breathing with other people. So there's a kind of negotiation going on between various forms of mobility. But particularly air travel and international travel have been the hardest to defend, given both their environmental impact and the ways in which the COVID story has been constructed. Despite the fact that there isn't much evidence that the actual border closing or preventing international travel has much impact on actually dealing with COVID, because it almost always happens after the R value or the transmission rate is past 1 within the area that's being closed down. So it doesn't actually. I mean, there's epidemiological evidence from flu before COVID that this was not really a useful way of doing things. So these kinds of meetings like this provide an important way to discuss how we can think about the value of travel in the future. And I'm particularly interested in international travel, because we all know that we would be attending a meeting like this or meetings like this, and it has its negative downsides. We knew that already from thinking about transition and climate change. But we also know that what we're doing now, however many opportunities it provides to the 500 or 600 people that signed up to be in the audience here, also closes down opportunities in the kinds of things that John would talk about in relation to face-to-face meetings that could be produced through and in relation to virtual mobilities. So I would ask,
is that a good place to stop? Is that all right?
Yeah. I've just got one sentence. How might we then revalue global mobilities post-COVID? How might we recognise the dangers of moral geographies of localism? Thank you.
Very important question. Thank you very much indeed, Tim. We'll go straight on then to Mimi. So over to you, Mimi. I'm just sending you live as well. There you go.
Okay, thank you. It's wonderful to be with you all from a distance. I'm here in Philadelphia, but having spent much time at Lancaster, it's great to be honoring John's legacy in this way. So I'm going to share some slides. Let me see how this works. Okay, can you all now see my slides? Yeah.
They should be up now, yes.
Okay. So really quickly, I'm going to try to talk about mobility justice in relation to pandemic immobilities and mobilities. And I'll be drawing on some ideas from my book, Mobility Justice, which had the subtitle, The Politics of Movement in an Age of Extremes. And I feel like we're in an even more starkly extreme moment. And our response to the pandemic and our hopes for recovery, I believe, are deeply dependent on how we deal with problems of mobility justice. And I'm going to try to quickly make 3 points about that. The first is that viral mobilities, that is this virus hitchhiking on human hosts around the world, have been pathologized and racialized, and they've brought a vast intensification of existing uneven mobilities, immobilities, and mobility injustices. Secondly, the pandemic has disrupted everyday mobilities and drastically reorganized others into new material assemblages and temporal patterns. And then finally, I'll ask how we can move beyond arrested mobilities. So first point about this kind of intensification of uneven mobilities and immobilities and the relation between them. We first started to see a disruption of mobility when cruise ships were being quarantined, and we started, I think, back in February and March to understand how quickly this virus kind of tore through enclosed spaces. And that led to this complete sort of shutdown of the cruise industry and ports of entry. You also see a tanker ship in the background there, and we're reminded of the kind of crash in fossil fuel demand and all of the oil that had to just be stored on tankers at sea. We also saw the collapse, of course, of airline networks and the need to store airplanes in deserts and on runways as the kind of circulation of these kind of images and these kind of realizations of this frozen mobility. Of course, associated with that was this rush of people to come home. This is a US airport shortly after it was announced that there were going to be restrictions on borders and air travel. And so we see this kind of disrupted mobility in the sense of this kind of turbulent churning of people returning from around the world. At the same time, by April 2020, 130 countries introduced entry restrictions at borders. And it quickly became clear, as the Migration Policy Institute puts it, that crossing an international border to a country of safety and filing an asylum claim is no longer possible in many places, a seismic shock to the foundations of post-World War II international protection systems that rely on the goodwill of national governments. So the closure of borders was not just, say, as Tim mentioned, Trump closing, flights from China or flights from Europe, but it was the closure of, for example, the US-Mexico border. It was the closure of the asylum system. It was the enclosure of humanitarian refugee systems. And Charles Heller has written about this as the war on the virus being used to justify and step up the war on migrants. And looking back in the Handbook of Mobilities Research that we published in 2014, Roger Keel wrote about there that there's this historical reality of the continued treatment of the diseased, at that time it was different diseases, as foreign bodies through an often racialized phantasmagoric representation that treats the sick body of an individual as an intruding threat to the supposedly healthy national body. Of course, we knew that soon that the virus was already inside the supposedly healthy national body. It wasn't coming from outside. So this is the scenes of largely Central American migrants stopped at the US border, and that was forced to, Mexico was forced to keep those asylum seekers and refugees on their side of the border, where they remain in camps as weather conditions worsen and the virus is spreading. We also saw this huge expulsion of people out of India's cities, right, back to their villages, and this major wave of internal migration of the kind of dispossessed, the denizens of informal settlements who had to sort of quickly decamp. So some people confined in camps, other people's forced to decamp out of the city, and often without a means of transportation. So when we talk about the sort of disruption of mobility and the stoppage of mobility, it also instigated this huge movement of peoples in many ways under very difficult conditions. So that leads me to my second point, which is that there are new material and temporal assemblages of everyday mobilities that are emerging. And here I want to talk about a question that I think one of our viewers already raised in the question area about, you know, the incredible transformation of urban transportation systems. So it's been kind of lauded that in Europe, over 1,000 kilometers of new bike lanes have been implemented during COVID. €1 billion have been budgeted to allocate for cycling promotion across Europe. Here we see pictures of the mayor of Paris jumping on a bike, and the World Health Organization calling for, whenever feasible, considering moving around using bicycles or walking. We also saw a huge expansion of bike lanes in cities like Bogota in Colombia and in Mexico City, both mapped here with the new bike lanes, 550 kilometers in Bogota, and the making of the ciclovías into permanent 76 kilometers of existing ciclovías. And even here in the US, not as strong in its biking culture, we saw the scenes of sort of New York City, especially implementing new biking. Interestingly, women's cycling percentages went up by more than 80% in Boston, Chicago, Washington, DC in the summer months. And New York saw huge increases in cycling, but especially in women's cycling as these new bike lanes were made. So there was a dream, in a way, of a sort of silver lining or a so-called opportunity that COVID had brought to transform our transportation systems, with open streets being promoted. And this was linked to the whole push for the Green New Deal, and like that this is the kickstart we need to really rebuild our infrastructure, do low carbon, active transport, post-automobility transitions. But I want to point to the thing that happened at the same exact time, which is the explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. And this is really crucial because there was an immediate juxtaposition of the sort of better off people who were able to work at home, who were sort of calling for open streets and cycling campaigns and things like that, building bike infrastructure, versus people who were being shot by police on the streets, right? People being murdered. And this question of what is this moment, whose mobility is at stake here, and who are we mobilizing for? Are we mobilizing for bike lanes, or are we mobilizing because Black Lives Matter? So this movement is really important, and that just brings me to my third point about arrested mobilities. And I borrow this term from Charles T. Brown. And in the US, when we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, there's this deep history of the policing and criminalization of Black mobility ever since slavery ended. Freedom has been a search for mobility, for freedom of movement, at the same time as a repression and suppression of Black mobilities. There's this great book by Gretchen Soren called Driving While Black, African American Travel and the Road to Civil Rights. It's recently been made into a PBS documentary that's just been aired in the last week or so. These are some of the images from the book, from the documentary, of Black motorists throughout the 20th century, and the attacks on Black motorists by white Americans. Of course, when we talk about driving while Black, we might also think about the bus drivers, the Uber drivers, the people who are doing the essential work and putting themselves at risk and have suffered disproportionate infection with COVID during the pandemic. And so the point I want to make here is that there's been a really powerful movement in the United States, a movement that talks about mobility justice. Thinkers like Adonia Lugo, who wrote this great book, Bicycle Race, and the edited collection, Bicycle Justice and Urban Transformation, they had already been mobilizing around Black, Indigenous, and people of color's right to movements, right to mobilities, not to be policed. And groups like the Chicago Bike Collective, Equiticity, Slow Roll, that have been doing these kind of multiracial, multi-gendered bike rides through urban spaces to sort of claim a right to be there. So mobility is justice in this promotion of an event in July from Equiticity. So just to wrap up, I want to talk about overcoming arrested mobility. And that mobility, the arrested mobility is not just the disruption of the pandemic that made some of us have to stay at home and work remotely. It's about those people whose mobility is arrested when they try to move around because of their race, because of their gender, because of disabilities. Mobility justice is about more than low carbon, car-free open streets and a green transition, and so must pandemic recovery be. It's about the core principles of mobility justice to move freely without facing the over-policing of the carceral state, including immigration and customs enforcement at the border and within, and the violence of white supremacist racial, sexual, class domination of public space and of vehicles and of transit and spaces of movement. So to overcome what Charles Brown names arrested mobility, we need to center Black, Indigenous, and people of color in decision-making, as these movements have called for, as well as women, LGBTQ, et cetera, people and people with disabilities. And finally, I'll say mobility justice and pandemic recovery needs to do the following: recognize past harm and ongoing mobility inequities, which have led to the disproportionate exposure of Black and people of color and Indigenous people to the virus. We need to argue for infrastructural reparations and climate debt for which we actually owe climate reparations. We need to shift power away from the dominant kinetic elites. We need to restrain the overconsumption of energy and excessive travel by those kinetic elites. And we need to create rules for commoning, sharing, caring mobilities that reduce harm to the natural world and other living beings. And I will stop right there. Let's see if I can stop sharing. There we go.
Wow, thank you very much, Mimi. Crammed a hell of a lot into slightly more than 10 minutes, but certainly allowable. Thank you very much. So next up, I'm going to send you live immediately. Noel, you're live. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So let me start by thanking the people at Lancaster University for organizing what I think is a truly wonderful virtual event, and for also inviting me to be part of it. I am truly honored to be holding this exchange of ideas, which it really is, in the company of two very esteemed colleagues whose work has greatly influenced my own. And just as a reminder, it has been mentioned at the very beginning, but we are gathered here in memory of John Urry, a generous mentor and a pioneering scholar of mobility studies who left us much too early. And like Tim was saying at the very beginning, I also often wonder what he would be thinking right now. So the three keywords for this timely panel, COVID-19, mobilities, and futures, are interconnected in multiple ways. When I reflect upon the relation between mobilities and futures, the work of colleague anthropologist Ghassan Haj immediately comes to mind. In his work on waiting, Haj describes that when people feel well, they imagine and sense that they are moving well. A good life then presupposes a form of imaginary mobility, a sense that one is going somewhere in one's life. While the notion of waiting often entails anxieties and uncertainties, as it can last for weeks, months, or even years, it can also be interpreted or reinterpreted as a distinctive, active, and fulfilling form of relative immobility, or a productive, calculative, and positive immobility. Haj argues that when people do not have a sense of existential mobility in the present or the foreseeable future, that they start contemplating physical forms of mobility, and he was talking in particular about migration. The connecting thread that I see between mobilities and futures is existence. Existential philosophers, for instance, prioritize the flux and dynamic agency of concrete experiences of unique individuals. After all, the literal meaning of future is what is likely going to happen or exist in the time to come. Its etymological basis refers to growth or a process of becoming, and thus potential. As such, the concept is tightly linked to imaginaries and expectations that people hold. These connections are also evident in many metaphors people resort to when trying to articulate the feeling of moving on in the way they desire and imagine, and of being in control of their lives. This is related to the forward-moving quality of living towards the future and having meaningful projects. But then comes along a thing such as COVID-19. While situations of crisis are a cause of great distress for those affected, particularly the most vulnerable ones, they do offer scholars unique opportunities to study people and society, because crises intensify existing processes, revealing what works well and where there are problems. Each crisis is perceived as a potential threat, namely to change existing structures and practices. And the 2020 coronavirus crisis is not any different. The rapid spread of COVID-19 reconfirms how interconnected our mobile world has become, and the two speakers before have illustrated that. From a mobility studies perspective, one of the most striking things occurring during the global pandemic are the changed patterns of who and what moves when and where. The whole situation reveals quite sharply the many inequalities that exist related to the distribution of mobility and immobility. In most countries, the white-collar workforce retreats to the safety of their homes to do telework and lock themselves in. They can only become securely immobile because there is a whole army of essential service providers at their disposal to deliver whatever they ordered online, to supply the supermarkets, pharmacies and other stores that remain open during lockdowns, to pick up their garbage, etc. So while the well-off settle in the comfort of their income-guaranteed immobility at home, or in their second home even, a less fortunate part of the population has to engage in hypermobility in order to economically survive with all the viral infection risks this entails. And you can see that what I have prepared is repeating what speakers before me have said. So it's interesting how our thoughts are overlapping. In between these two categories that I just mentioned are those who are at home because they have become technically unemployed and who are craving to be mobile again to secure an income. Which forms of mobility are considered essential within a society depends very much on those actors who have the legal power to label them as such. The idea of essential mobilities is mostly used at a macro-social level in an instrumental way, whereby the movements under consideration are not valued as such, but because they serve a purpose that is considered crucial in contemporary society. And of course, one of the primary motives is economics. While the categorization of mobilities as essential or non-essential usually stays implicit, situations of crisis bring such distinctions clearly to the fore. As part of the crisis regimes of mobility and immobility, authorities in 2020 produced lists of services that they considered essential during the outbreak of COVID-19. Many of these were related to or included elements of transport, of essential people, those working in healthcare and public safety, caregivers, logistic workers, supermarket staff, emergency repair and maintenance service personnel, and also of essential goods, food and medical supplies and other things. And the corresponding infrastructure that is necessary to move these essential people and goods around, so public transport, airports, and other ports. Other mobilities were classified as non-essential, and these were temporarily suspended, falling under massive travel restrictions and border controls that were or are still being imposed. The sudden restrictions on mobility during this crisis make people realize how much they value moving around freely. And we can also understand this quite literally. As the COVID-19 crisis unfolded, one of the worries was that the grounding of people in the houses and apartments would make people even less physically active than they already were. While for some, a lockdown situation was received as a welcome period of physical rest and recuperation, many others tried to maintain a certain routine of physical outdoor activity where this still was allowed. Or they started exploring all kinds of creative indoor alternatives, often inspired by examples going viral via social media. This brings us to the notion of existential mobilities. Considerations concerning existential mobility are mostly situated on the micro level because of the focus on individual experience and a first-person point of view. Whenever the concept of existential mobility is used, it is somehow related to the quality of life, directly coupled or not with the quality of movement involved. During lockdowns, many people give existential reasons to walk, run, or cycle outdoors. For them, it simply feels good to be able to do this while they have to spend so much time confined inside the walls of their house or apartment. This adds, I think, an important dimension to Haj's understanding of existential mobility. The physical mobility he describes as a reaction to people feeling stuck is not to be understood solely in an abstract or symbolic way, such as migrating elsewhere, but can be taken quite literally in the sense that people want to feel movement. A crisis is often viewed as a moment when the essential structures of a system are under threat, from external forces or internal contradictions. When the first wave of the 2020 coronavirus crisis was at its highest point, and we witnessed dramatic changes to the pre-COVID-19 mobility patterns, many commentators saw this as an opportunity to radically reimagine the future. For instance, there were proposals to move to a more sustainable hypomobile practice, a slow mobility focus with more localized active mobility. And again, here we see connections with the previous speakers. In this sense, the word crisis was correctly chosen because etymologically it refers to a point at which change must come, for better or worse. However, many of the utopian dreamers show the total unawareness of their own privileged positionality and a lack of empathy towards people who have been experiencing 2020 in entirely different ways, usually not the most envied ones. If anything, a crisis situation such as the one surrounding COVID-19 lays bare and intensifies already existing mobility inequalities, revealing the uneven impacts of a pandemic among poor and vulnerable populations. In this light, it may not be entirely correct to argue that 2020 is the year the world stopped moving. As normal mobility patterns come to a halt for some, mobilities that are most often invisible because taken for granted become more noticeable. The coronavirus also confirms that not only mobility, but also immobility can be a kind of capital in the Bourdieuian sense, a right and resource that not everyone enjoys and has access to. In terms of mobility, a crisis such as the one the world is experiencing nicely shows how authorities develop their regimes of mobility. The pandemic puts those in power before a difficult choice: preserving lives, which implies heavily restricted mobilities, or saving the economy as much as possible by sticking to business as usual, also when it comes to mobilities. Not every government leader or government finds the right balance between these two imperatives. And the white elephant in the room during 2020, and not this room, but I mean society, is climate change, the hot topic of 2019. Preliminary research shows how COVID-19 mobility containment measures have led to quite a spectacular reduction in air pollution, particularly of travel or traffic-related air pollutants. Ironically then, the pandemic saves a lot of lives, of people who would normally have died from air pollution and traffic accidents. However, as soon as mobility restrictions are lifted, in most places, old mobility patterns are quickly restored. So the immediate health crisis surrounding COVID-19 may be resolved in the coming year, but the much larger issue of climate change needs to be urgently tackled. Mobility plays, I think, a very crucial role here, and this has been argued before too. So to finish, I think that mobility studies is more relevant now than it has ever been. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Noel. Okay, so thank you to all three of you. I suppose we're a little bit later than only a little bit actually, than we thought we would be at this stage. I think probably the easiest thing is to go round again. Unfortunately, it's difficult on this platform to really have a proper discussion, but I'll just go do another cycle round, and if you could just keep your responses and comments relatively brief. Imagine that you have about 3 or 4 minutes each, just to extemporize further on what you said yourselves, and of course to respond to the other two speakers. So Tim, over to you first, if that's okay.
Sure. Thank you, and thanks for the other presentations. I mean, I was thinking during those presentations that there is a way of misinterpreting, I guess, what my primary concern is with in my talk. So what I'm trying to get at, I think, is a general sense of the way mobility can be devalued, regardless of the kind of whether I agree with the response or don't agree with the response in terms of localism. And thinking about what Mimi was saying, it's certainly the case that some of those concerns can come from a position of my privilege. I mean, all of us here, I mean, the screen I'm looking at only has 4 people on, not 500, but have benefited from travel. We've travelled to talk about mobility, and we travelled to talk to people about the need to travel less. Even I once travelled from Boston to Cape Town to talk about sustainability, and that is a common occurrence for academics involved both in mobilities research, mobilities meetings all over the world. I've met Mimi in many places that aren't either of our places we live, and Noel as well. And I think that what could happen after COVID is some sense of a mobility being seen as a general problem, and that the people that are on the negative end of that devaluation of mobility being the wrong people. So I think this is what comes back to what we're both everyone's talking about in terms of the inequalities that are being revealed by COVID, more starkly than ever before, is that who's going to stop moving? Is it going to be the people in business class on airplanes lubricating global logistic chains? I don't think so. It's going to be other people. And so some of the questions that are coming up about leisure, how should we conceive of travel and leisure and the relationship between them, when leisure is, the kinds of things people do when they travel exceed business. There are all kinds of other things that are going on. And I do realise here I'm not talking about people that haven't had the privilege of that kind of mobility. Anyway, that's enough for me for now.
Excellent. Thanks, Tim. Yeah, we will certainly turn to some of your questions. So please do post them in the Q&A. Mimi, over to you.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, I wanted to just pick up on what both Tim and Noel were thinking about in terms of climate change, and whether we've sort of not been focusing on the climate crisis because we're focusing on the COVID crisis, and kind of and as well as the claim that, like, okay, what we're learning from the response to the COVID crisis are lessons that we can apply to the climate crisis, which is that we need, an extreme makeover, transformation of how we do mobilities. And I wanted to just sort of think through that in relation to what I was talking about, to say so much of the emphasis on low carbon transitions, sustainability transitions, have been on kind of reducing CO2 emissions. And if we have electric vehicles, and we have more public transit, and if we have better bike infrastructure, and the Green New Deal, also includes, housing, transformations of housing, including affordable housing and energy efficient housing, and a lot of like building and retrofitting of new systems. But I continue to think that really the solution to the climate crisis also requires a focus on mobility injustices, because it's the mobility injustices that have created this huge gap in those who are able to overconsume travel and overconsume energy and overconsume big houses, especially in the United States, and including, as Tim says, academics and ourselves. And so I feel like there's a real threat that coming out of the COVID crisis, that we're going to see the kinetic elites keep working from home and keep traveling and keep accessing resources and goods and services through protected bubbles and protected corridors. And we see these kind of special residency and citizenship rights being given to like nomadic workers, in Barbados or Antigua or something. And then on the other hand, increasingly limited, constricted, and dangerous mobilities for the subaltern, right? For those without mobility capital, and with limited self-determination of their mobilities. And so we really need to like focus on that to solve the climate crisis. Those things are interconnected.
Excellent. Thank you, Mimi. Noel, your turn.
Thank you. Yeah, there are so many thoughts and there's so little time, so we have to focus on certain things. When Tim was talking about the worry of that mobility may be devalued, or certain types of mobility may be devalued, I was of course immediately thinking about certain things that he has written about himself, and it's to put this in a historical perspective. And of course, when you do that, you see that in different time periods, it is different values being attached to different forms of mobility and immobility. And so there's like interesting shifts. It's like going back and forth the whole time. And what to me is most interesting is actually who has, the power to determine the shifts to occur and how the shifts are occurring. And if we are indeed in a time period where such a shift is happening, then it would be very interesting to study and to try to disentangle the mechanisms that are behind this, how it basically works, and how you can also make it a dominant narrative, that a certain type of mobility all of a sudden becomes much less valuable and important than it used to be. One other thing that we haven't mentioned too much, because we have been focusing a lot on people, and inequalities in terms of people moving. I wonder what can be said about, and of course maybe then equality is not the right word, but whether there are also marked changes in how things are moving, and what COVID-19 is doing to objects moving or not moving. I think that's equally interesting too, because that can also reveal things that we are maybe not looking at right now because we are focusing on other things. In terms of Mimi, of course, mobility justice, I think is a crucial concept. It's very tricky to think of, how can we make it happen? And I was also thinking, because we have all been, and me myself too, we are talking also about inequalities, and so the issue of equality. And I'm sometimes wondering whether also when we are talking about mobility, should we aim for more equal mobilities or more equalities, or for more equity within mobility? And of course, equity is a different concept and applies a different approach. And so this is maybe something that we can discuss. What I also take away from Mimi is, of course, this huge and very important question about whose mobility is at stake and what are we actually defending, and whose rights and justices are we defending. And I think this, of course, needs a very contextualized approach, because in different contexts, the situation is different, but this should be one of the very important questions, I think, when we are trying to solve issues, that we are trying to also be aware of whose problems are we solving, and are we, by solving problems of some, maybe not creating problems for others. I will stop here, I think.
Excellent. Thanks, Noel. Okay, that was excellent. We're going to move now to the Q&A. I will do my best to go through the questions in a sort of first come, first served kind of fairness, but sometimes they can be grouped together, so apologies if your question is grouped, or unfortunately if we don't get to it in time. So the first question, which Mimi has already alluded to, but maybe, and again, all three speakers feel free to respond or not. I mean, maybe you can raise your hand for me and I'll put you on live. The first one is from Sina Sola Ollison in Copenhagen. She asks, we have seen temporary bicycle infrastructure pop up during COVID in cities from Berlin to Bogota, even here in Liverpool, I should add. Do you think these temporary initiatives can create long-term change towards sustainable urban mobility? Does anybody want to answer that question? Yeah, okay, thanks, Mimi.
Yeah, so I mean, I said a little bit about that in my talk, but I'll just add to that one thing, it relates to also what Noel was saying about our movement of our bodies, our activation of our bodies, and that there is a strong argument that says when people change their daily practices and habits and routines and they try bicycling, that it makes it much easier to then keep going with it. So there is this like hope that now that so many people have, and as I said, it's like 80% plus increases in many American cities. So many people have tried cycling now as a way to move around that they've felt it in their bodies. They've activated a different form of mobility as well as walking. And so that's like awakened maybe something that they'll keep going with and maybe keep pressure on city governments and transport planners and stuff to enable that to continue to happen. So in that sense, I think it does make a difference.
Great. Thanks, Mimi. So the next question is from Hong Lu Sin, who basically is asked about the innate human desire to explore and find out about elsewheres, which you were in a sense talking about to some extent, Tim. So how can we address, is there a danger that in localization we lose much of this sort of innate human desire, and how can we address this while maintaining that tourists should not travel in the immediate future? I mean, maybe if I can just extend that myself, to what extent is a climate change compatible, well, a low carbon future compatible with very little exploration of exotic elsewheres? I don't know if you want to respond to that, Tim.
So just with a few provisos, I'm uneasy talking about things that are innate, and I'm also uneasy talking about exotic things. but I do think that having said that, I do think that that is kind of at the core of the question that I'm asking myself, which is somewhat quaintly, humanistic in some, fairly old-fashioned way in relation to questions of politics and justice, which I'm completely and utterly invested in. But I do think they're connected. I mean, I do think that there's something to be gained from the process of, in a corporeal way, journeying, and I mean by that, that is true of cycling and walking and discovering your locality, but something beyond the locality. I think that there's something more to be gained from that too, which and it doesn't always lead to some kind of cosmopolitan awakening of, anti-racist progressive thought by meeting other people while you're traveling. It can have the opposite effect on some people. But I do think that that to shut down that possibility of arriving somewhere where the air feels different, where the rain is different, where the texture of life is completely different, I think is something to worry about, while recognizing that still is a massively privileged experience in terms of the world's population now. I mean, I do think it's slightly back to some of the discussions when in sort of 80s and 90s, when post-structuralists, postmodernists were talking about the author being dead, and there were feminist articles saying, just as we're allowed to be authors, you suddenly say we can't be authors anymore. And I feel there's a little bit about the same with travel, that some kinds of travel for leisure, essentially, which might seem the most frivolous thing, are just becoming available to more people than ever have in the history of the world. And suddenly that being foreclosed, I think, is problematic, where I'm much less worried about people who travel for other reasons, including academics, including business people. Their travel being limited seems to make more sense because of it's already been privileged in various ways. So I feel like we do need to think carefully about travel and tourism and leisure, as I'm sure, again, to raise John Urry's name, he would want us to think about in relation to tourism. How do you continue to have those events where people engage in a corporeal way with things that are dramatically different from them in ways that you can't do in your local area? Although you can meet people that are very different from you and have different things locally as well, but it's different.
Thanks, Tim. Noel, is that a question you'd like to respond to, or shall I move on to another one? I thought that might be a good one for you. Yeah,
I'm also looking because there are many questions, so it's I can of course talk through this one too, but yeah, I mean, feel free. And as you say, there are lots of questions, and but my answer would go very much in the direction of what Tim was saying. Of course, many people are now thinking, and this is this is always happening in times of crisis. We are thinking about futures and how the future may be different, and what kind of implications it will have. And this is not the first time. Also when the internet started booming, then also people were predicting that travel would disappear because everybody would be doing things online, and this has not happened. And it's precisely because what Tim has been expressing, and so it's this more phenomenological approach of the importance of sensing that you are in other places. The question is, of course, at which cost this comes, and who is bearing the cost of that kind of activity. And that's, of course, again bringing us to mobility justice.
Great, thanks, Noel. So I'm just trying to keep up. It's actually quite challenging to keep up with all the questions, and certainly to try and group them in any sort of sense. We have the next question is I think a very nice one. It says, this is from Kevin Lima, who says, in a future where the fear of the virus still exists and most of the jobs can be done remotely, will leisure alone be enough to justify the necessity of physical mobility? Do people need to travel long distances? Of course, this is related to a large extent of what we've just been discussing, but I particularly like this aspect of whether leisure is being dismissed. It's just too frivolous an issue to enable mobilities. I don't know if any of you would like to respond to that. Yeah, no, thanks. Let me just make you know.
Yes, so to a certain extent it speaks to what I was saying, and also the idea that I'm developing for the article that will be part of this pandemic mobility special issue. So this difference between essential and existential mobilities, and of course, according to many people and according to most authorities, leisure is non-essential. It's not essential, although of course the travel and tourism industry has been taking very interesting initiatives this year to actually convince all kind of actors that it is essential. the question is whether it is existential too, and again it overlaps with the question we just answered. But in the future, mobilities will not be limited to leisure. I mean, if you look at all the business-related travel, and actually right now, I mean, we are speaking as if there is no mobility, there's no people traveling. I actually invite all people after this talk to go to these websites, to these flight trackers, and just check which kind of flights are moving across the world. And it's not all only goods that are being transported. There's lots of people who are traveling how they work actually right now. So this is happening now. This will continue happening. But then again, the question is at which cost and who will be bearing the cost.
Great, thanks, Noel. So the next two I'm going to take together because I think that they fit quite nicely. So Stephen McConaughey asks that Tim touched briefly on the value people associate with travel time, and Noel talked about the value of existential mobility, including the inequalities inherent in the current situation. Tim has talked more about the inequalities of the situation. There's some suggestion that some people have been quite reflective over the past months about their mobility practices and what they are gaining and losing by travelling or not travelling. Do the panel think growing awareness or reflectiveness embodies an opportunity to reconfigure the mobility system into something more equitable? And Tim Birabi asks, is there a chance for the future of mobility can be used as an instrument to shape equality, equity going forward? Mimi, is that okay? Do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, I had some thoughts on the previous questions too, and maybe they wrap in with this question as well, which is, yes, like reflection and reflexivity are going to be crucial going forward, especially because I'm saying that those who are more privileged need to really reflect on their impact on others, and that what we think of as freedom of mobility, or the liberty enjoyed by some, it impinges on other people and living things and places. And so we do need to reflect on that, including within tourism. With that said, about like, is tourism essential? Just to go back to that point, I mean, there are economies in the world that are completely tourism dependent, right? And they've had a complete crash of their tourist-based job sector, which is devastating, especially for many small island states, right, that really depend on tourism. And so the question going forward has to be not just like, okay, who is tourism, do I get to enjoy tourism or not? But what about the people who rely on it, and how can their countries kind of move forward, or particular cities that have hugely dependent tourism sectors, and including like New York City, right? And there, I think it's a question of like, we need to reimagine and rethink what other economic possibilities are there, because we were already suffering from a kind of over-tourism and over-dependence on tourism. So how can we break away from that, and how can we have more justice within those economies in a sort of post-tourist model, which doesn't mean abolishing all tourism altogether, but thinking what would a more just tourism look like? And is there a way to imagine more like regenerative processes of travel and exchange? And I also think we should think about like, well, migrants are also traveling and travelers, and they're experiencing new, sensations, new environments, new atmospheres around them. And so we should think about the various kinds of travel, how they intersect, and how can we bring justice both to tourism and to migration, and rebuild economies around new ways of doing things.
Thanks, Mimi. Noel, yes, over to you.
Just briefly, and picking in on the issue of reflection. Of course, reflection is important, but reflection is not enough. And I'm thinking we should be aware of not falling into a kind of neoliberal trap where, this idea that people should take responsibility and should take, you know, things in their own hands. Reflection is important, but we also need more structural measures. I'm thinking of the 1990s, where as mass tourism was growing, and you know, there was all these worries about these numbers, and then people also started coming up with all these alternative forms of tourism, and so this was also mainly in the hands of.
You've suddenly muted for some reason there. Oh, we missed the last sentence.
Sorry, I was being censored here by. No, I was saying that. So in the 1990s, so all these small-scale initiatives came up to offer alternatives, so ecotourism and green tourism and all these things. But unfortunately, this didn't change tourism. It didn't change the system, and so it's of course much more tricky to go for systemic change. And so if we want to do that, we have to do it in smart ways. And I'm thinking very much along the way of what Mimi was saying, also of these people who are now like practicing bicycling and feeling it and experiencing it. But that, of course, should go hand in hand with then better bicycle infrastructure. Because if there's not a good infrastructure, then people will also stop doing this. And so it needs to be both, I think.
Thanks very much, Noel. So the next question, I think, thanks for all your questions again. I think we just have to talk about cars. So there is a question there about cars. How do you see the future of the car with the sales of electric cars continuously rising, and this perception of the car as safe and assuming new roles in daily lives? For example, in concerts, new forms of a return to drive-in culture. Do any of you want to talk about that? And of course, I would add to that the increasing stigmatization of public transport, which is, of course, disastrous. Anybody want to talk to that? A few words? Yeah, is that okay? Thanks, Mimi.
Sure, I'm always happy to talk about cars. Where to begin? I mean, there's a lot to say about it, but so one issue is, yes, that people are taking to their cars in greater numbers in the pandemic situation, in under quarantines, because they feel like they're safer. They're in that cocoon, right? The carcoon, the private bubble. Where I live in suburban Philadelphia, they've shut down school buses for children, are very limited now in terms of the numbers of children who can be on a school bus. It's created huge traffic jams of parents driving their suburban children to school because we don't have sidewalks and bicycle infrastructure, and it's not safe, especially with all the traffic of all the other parents, right, to let the kids out on the streets. So it's like this ridiculous kind of catch-22, right, where we're seeing more car driving. We've also had a spike in pedestrian and bicyclist deaths, but in car crashes, right? Because of this unsafe infrastructure, more people cycling, but also more cars kind of speeding on the emptier roadways. So it just is bringing out all the sort of paradoxes of American automobility system. And within that, one of the sort of solutions being proposed for climate change is electrification, right, and electric vehicles. And I've been saying, you know, for at least 15 years that more electric vehicles, if they're still the private system of automobility, they're not going to help. They're going to keep creating this private bubble of privileged drivers protecting themselves from the outside world. There's still going to be crashes, and there's still going to be this huge resource extraction. All right, maybe it'll be low carbon and not fossil fuels, but batteries are going to require huge amounts of lithium and other resources, and mining that's happening. And there's huge movements happening across the world, and like Latin America, anti-extractivist, anti-mining movements, and a big question over the scale of electrification that we need. How are we going to manage the resource inequalities around the world? So all of that to me means we need to drive less. We need to have less private automobility for multiple reasons.
Thank you very much, Mimi. The next question is about stuff. and in particular a very important form of stuff, which is food. Do any of you want to reflect on food mobilities? Tim, thank you.
Yeah. Oh. Just going back to the previous thing, I'm amused by, or amused or despairing at the whole idea, the Biden things where everyone's in cars and they come to everyone sit in a car and listen to him speak. It's interesting. I mean, better than the alternative in some ways, but still the idea of that emphasizing safety is a very interesting thing. The food thing is, I think that this is a kind of issue which is one of the fundamental things at the start or the origin of this crisis is, is a food question. It was made into a very dramatic story of wet markets in China, but the real story, I think, is about the way that we interact with the natural, I'll put natural in scare quotes, the natural world, through incursions into these environments that didn't used to happen, so that we come into contact with more and more kinds of wildlife, not necessarily to eat it, just because we're growing things in new places and making things in new places, and therefore whatever we are deciding to eat, we are engaging the world in a different way through agribusiness. And that way of engaging, which has a mobilities aspect, is roads being driven into rainforests, it's logistical chains being developed in places that didn't used to have them in the same way that they have them now. And that way in which we are dealing with food is creating these possibilities for viruses to emerge and for viruses to cross species boundaries in particular ways. So that's the main way that I think about COVID in relation to food. As I guess the other end of that is our shopping, is how we have experienced shopping in new ways under COVID. I mean, whether it's delivery schemes being massively, like tens of thousands of people being hired in Britain for delivery systems that didn't used to exist, so you can have food delivered to your door. So people have to be driving all the time in order to deliver to us, or the ways that we have to negotiate going to a supermarket and queuing outside and going in with certain numbers of people at a certain time. So I think, yes, food has been, mobility nexus has been something that's been illustrated. I think Mimi has something to say about that.
I just wanted to add a couple more dimensions to that, which is that there's been these huge outbreaks of COVID in meat packing plants in the United States, and there's a huge issue around migrant farm workers, and our entire food system is reliant on these food processing plants, these grocery store workers, these warehouse and delivery workers, and these migrant farm laborers to function. And so there's just like this huge confluence of disaster in our food system, a disruption of our food system, and this like question of the rationality of this system as we move forward, which I think calls for, there's a movement now across the Americas for food sovereignty and food justice, and it sort of picks apart all of these things that are sort of coming to a head in the COVID crisis.
Thank you very much, Mimi. Moving on, we've got about 5 minutes left, and even just the questions that we've managed to publish, we'll struggle to dash through all of these. My apologies to everybody. We've got a nice comment from Louise about the freight sector having a nice time with all the freed up space on the railway network, which is interesting. But Emma asks about whether there's a need for a more organised or institutionalised discussion of value and privilege and mobility and immobility, particularly in the context of COVID. Does anybody want to respond to that one? I mean, just on that point, just to add a bit more, many of you have asked about questions of power and power relations in mobility systems, and in a sense, what can be done about that, what can be learnt from that from COVID. Hopefully the response will address some of those questions too. Does anybody want to go on that one? If not, perhaps we can move on. I think that the next one's also quite important in terms of talking about the way in which digital cultures interact with specific forms of and expectations of mobility. So Raoul asks, is there a risk that once it's possible to travel again, the Instagram generation makes travel a hyper-idealized, merely aesthetic experience without the type of meaningful symbolic exchange that Tim was talking about, and presumably also revalorizing this kind of travel regardless, and the amount of that travel regardless of its climate consequences. Does anybody want to talk to that one? Okay, thank you. Tim, yeah, thank you. That would be good.
So this is a kind of cumulative response to things I've been reading and what you've been saying. I mean, I think that fundamentally, yes, there is a need for institutional stroke political cultural contemplation of mobility issues. I mean, I guess that's what mobility scholars have been arguing since mobility scholarship started, is that you know, is great for us in our disciplines and in our interdisciplinary environment to be talking about it, but the point is to engage a wider community and for us to listen to them. I mean, Mimi's dealt with, you know, has found, I don't know whether you inspired them, Mimi, or it was coincidental, but the mobility justice movement of untokening, which is this incredible group in Philadelphia, right? But they're national in the US now, I think, of talking about mobility justice in a way that we can learn from, because the group, as far as I understand it, is not people like me, and so so there's a two-way relationship there, and I think that government is, you know, has to rethink these issues, but they aren't going to do it, whatever government it is, regardless of who's in charge of it, without people like untokening, academics who are interested in questioning hegemonic ways of moving, and you know, all kinds of actors in thinking about how we move in the future, and how we value it, how we do it, and what systems, institutions, and infrastructures need to be in place for it to happen. Because you're not talking about an immobilized world, you're talking about a differently mobilized world. And capitalism has an incredible capacity to spring back to something that's just like it did before a crisis, after a crisis. So, you know, I think some things have changed. I don't know how the cruise industry can survive after this, personally. I mean, I don't know who would want to go on a ship after those stories that Mimi was talking about. The airline industry is going to have a hard, it's very difficult to imagine the airline industry being the same, but it's surprising, you know, how things can spring back. So I think the more pressure we can put academically, politically, the better.
Thanks very much, Tim. Noel, yes.
Yes, as Tim was speaking, and I was trying to process some of the questions that you had been asking us to answer, I was thinking also, and looking through the people who are posting these questions, I recognize many names. So most of the people probably attending are working within academia, and so also for academics, travel is hugely important, and it's actually it has become one of the few perks that is left in academia, and so many people are actually still in academia because one of the few things left was travel, because, you know, there's a lot of things that academics do is quite boring, but they can still travel now and then. And so it's a very interesting thought exercise. So if you would permanently take away the travel in academia, what that would do, who would leave, and what kind of other perks would be reinvented. So whether it's Instagram generation of academics, we have created a certain need for travel, and if that to a certain extent will become limited or impossible, then it will be interesting to see what we will come up with to compensate.
Thank you, Noel. We officially have 1 minute left, but if attendees can sort of hang around a little bit longer, I just want to group these last few questions together. So the first one really is about the way in which lockdown has occluded various forms of mobility justice, made it more difficult. We have a question from Susanna talking about the Dominican Republic, and another from Anne-Marie Fortier talking about the valorization of the household, even as it's been maybe a prison for many, including domestic abuse. So there's those questions, and then secondly, there's really just sort of the disciplinary question, which is that how does mobility studies respond to this moment? So I'll open up both of those questions to both of you, and I suppose as it's the last round, we'll go through all three of you if you want to take it in turns. Just to mix things up, we'll go in reverse order. So we'll start with you, Noel, if that's okay.
Yes, so lockdowns, yeah, so lockdowns have again and maybe intensified already existing problems. When I hear about domestic violence and things, so these are things that have very clearly been revealed, but also in terms of education. So children that have a very hard time being schooled from a home situation because they have a very unstable internet connection, or they don't have laptops, and so it has again intensified a lot of inequalities, and it has maybe made us aware of existing ones that are maybe hidden in society, but that have become more visible. So it's of course not all shiny. And what is very interesting now in the European context, that many countries are actually moving again to a situation of lockdown, but they are not calling it a lockdown because apparently this was very traumatic, and so they are the measures are now as strict as they were before, but the word lockdown is being avoided. It's very interesting how that is discursively being played out. And then in terms of mobility studies and yeah, the future, as I ended also my little piece in the beginning, I think more now than ever you see the importance of mobility. And I also like the fact that we are clearly dealing with issues, but we also take our time to reflect upon it. I've also been engaged in some of these special issues that were put out by people in tourism studies, and these were very quick things, not very reflexive, and we seem to be making more time to reflect and to come up maybe with better scholarship. So in a sense also we are maybe good examples of slow science, and how slow science leads maybe to better better science and better outcomes and better solutions.
Thank you very much, Noel. Mimi.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just kind of echo this point that access to safe homes is a privilege that not everybody has, just as access to safe mobilities is racialized and class divided and gender divided. So is the home. Whether that's for women and others facing domestic violence, or LGBTQ youth, for example, confined at home, where getting out of home has been really important to previous generations, and also to people, whose homes are overcrowded, right? At home has become a vector of infection as well. So it's not just a safe place for everybody. And in relation to that, I think the field of mobility studies, its significance is to sort of help us see and think through some of these aspects, and also that all the different kinds of mobility in the world, like that there's a relationship between the kinds of transformations we need, whether it's a question of migration and migrant justice, climate justice movements, racial justice movements, food justice movements. They all have this component of mobility's inequities embedded within them. And if we can sort of have that conversation and understand those connections, that will help us, I think, push forward a larger structural change, because it will require popular movements to sort of push for the change. And I think we do see that happening. The untokening actually arises not in Philadelphia, and they were using the concept of mobility justice separate from the academic literature in a way, and we kind of stumbled upon each other, partly as people in California, Los Angeles, and a group called People for Mobility Justice as well. And so there's a whole group of scholars, and we've now created something called the Mobility Justice Research Network. And these are like scholar activists, I would call them, and it spans North America and Latin America. And we're doing work in terms of translation of some of this literature between English and Spanish and possibly into French, and to try to connect to these movements. And I hope that the field of mobility studies is going to be, part of this field of scholar activist mobilization.
Thank you very much, Mimi. Tim, over to you.
I don't have much to add to what my colleagues have been saying. I mean, I think that what we do as scholars and as parents and activists, political citizens, all of those things, or even tourists, is important. And I think I was teaching my geographies of mobility class as this started, and I'm teaching it again now. Everything that's in the class is illustrated by what's happening in the world. I mean, 2 years ago, you could always find something happening that was illustrative of what Mobilities work is doing and that Mobilities work could contribute to. But right now, it's like, it's like, see, you just look outside, but it's happening. What I was talking about, that's what's happening. And so the teaching is important. And I think, special issues of Mobilities, they're important, right? So that's happening, and continuing to work with as many different groups as we can to think through these mobilities issues and relate them to other issues, because not everything, I mean, the danger is you think everything's about mobilities once we do this sort of scholarship, and clearly there are other ways of thinking that are equally valuable to combine with the way that mobility scholarship works. We don't want to fetishize it, but it is obviously fundamentally important in these times. So it's really good to hear my colleagues speak about that and to have so many interesting questions. So thank you for organising this.
Well, thank you. So thank you to all three of you for a really unbelievably wonderful discussion. I have to admit that I might have missed part of it by trying to curate it. So just to tell everybody that this event was recorded, and I, like many of you, will be going back to watch some of it to catch up on everything that was said. Yes, so thank you again to all three of you, and again to Louise in the background. I've greatly enjoyed this. I hope you all watching have as much as I have. And all it remains for me to say really is to look out for our special issue in Mobilities. And thank you very much for joining us. Good night.